"Is this seat only for the rich?" asked the young girl to the mafia boss sitting alone at the Christmas Café, her voice a small but steady flame in the cold evening air. "Welcome back to the family, everyone. And if you are just joining our circle of soul-stirring stories, we are so incredibly grateful to have you here in our warm corner of the world." Before we dive into this breathtaking journey of shadows and light, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. It truly helps our family grow and allows us to keep bringing these tales to life for you. We'd love to know where in the world you are watching from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. We read every single one because you aren't just an audience to us, you are the heart of everything we do. Now, let us begin the story of a man who thought he had no soul and a girl who proved him wrong. The moment Miriam Sardi's question hung in the air, the golden warmth of the cafe seemed to crystallize into a sharp, expectant silence. Bruno Marchetti did not move at first, his silhouette framed against the frost-etched window like a statue carved from obsidian and regret. He was the lion of the city's underworld, a man whose name was whispered in back alleys and guarded boardrooms alike. Yet here he sat in a charcoal wool coat that cost more than Miriam's family earned in a year, looking strangely hollow. The contrast between them was a physical ache. Bruno's hands, large and marked by the dark ink of his heritage, rested beside a delicate porcelain cup, while Miriam stood before him like a stray lamb seeking shelter from the blizzard. She was draped in a burgundy coat that swallowed her small frame, the sleeves falling past her knuckles as she clutched a simple leather bag to her chest with fingers turned a raw, biting red from the trek through the snow. There was no wealth in her pockets, only a quiet, desperate dignity that refused to be intimidated by the coldness in his eyes or the lethal reputation that kept the other tables crowded and his own isolated. As Bruno finally tilted his head, the light caught the tattoos on his neck, symbols of a life built on iron and blood, yet his gaze lingered on her face with a flicker of something long forgotten, a ghost of a memory from a time before he became a monster. He looked at her damp hair, the way she shivered despite her bravado, and the sheer audacity of her presence in his personal dead zone. The air between them stilled, the scent of cinnamon and expensive tobacco swirling together as the predator and the innocent locked eyes. For the first time in a decade, Bruno felt the heavy armor of his cynicism crack, surprised by the girl who saw a man where everyone else saw a king or a killer. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his dark eyes searching hers for fear and finding only a weary kind of hope. Then, with a voice as deep and smooth as the midnight sea, he pulled out the chair and spoke the words that would change both of their destinies forever. "No," he said, his gaze never wavering from her small, hopeful face. "It is for the brave." As the chair scraped back against the polished wood floor, a sudden hush seemed to ripple through the nearby tables, though neither Miriam nor Bruno turned to acknowledge the curious stares of the cafe's wealthier patrons. Bruno adjusted the cuff of his charcoal coat, subtly shifting his posture so the heavy fabric obscured the dark, jagged ink that climbed his neck, the blood marks of the Marchetti legacy that usually sent people running in the opposite direction. He watched the young girl settle into the seat, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were entering a cathedral rather than a coffee shop. Miriam reached up with trembling, cold-nipped fingers to brush the melting snowflakes from her burgundy lapel, her gaze falling upon a single, mismatched button sewn near her collar. It was a bright, burnished gold star, scratched and weathered but shining with a defiance that matched the look in her eyes. Bruno found himself mesmerized by that small, cheap piece of metal. It was the only bright thing in a world he had spent years painting in shades of gray and crimson. He kept his hands clasped firmly in front of him, hiding the scarred knuckles that told the story of a dark history he hoped this girl would never have to understand. Miriam noticed his gaze and a small, genuine smile touched her lips, a contrast to the weary lines on her young face. She told him that the button was her lucky star, a keepsake from her mother who had told her that as long as she wore it, the darkness of the city could never truly swallow her whole. Bruno felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest at her words, a memory of a time when he, too, believed in charms and light before the family business demanded he trade his innocence for iron. He didn't tell her that he was the very darkness her mother had warned her about, nor did he mention that the protection fees his men collected were the reason her coat was 3 sizes too big and her boots were worn through to the soles. Instead, he stayed in the shadows of his own identity, listening to her talk about the beauty of the snow and the hope of the holiday, his silence serving as a temporary sanctuary. For a few fleeting moments, the blood on his hands felt a little less heavy, washed away by the simple, starlit faith of a girl who had no idea she was sitting across from the man who owned the very air she breathed. When the warmth of the cafe finally became a memory and the heavy glass door clicked shut behind Miriam, the silence she left in her wake felt heavier to Bruno than any contract he had ever signed. He stood by the fogged window for a long moment, watching her burgundy coat, a small, defiant spark of color, disappear into the swirling gray of the blizzard, before he pulled his own collar high to hide the ink on his skin and stepped out into the biting wind. He kept a distance that only a man trained in the shadows could maintain, his expensive boots crunching softly on the packed ice as he tracked her through the changing landscape of the city. The glittering storefronts of the high-rent district soon gave way to the skeletal remains of the industrial ward, where the street lamps flickered with a dying yellow pulse, and the festive wreaths were replaced by rusted fire escapes and boarded-up windows. Bruno felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature as he watched Miriam navigate the treacherous, unshoveled sidewalks, her small frame swaying slightly against the gusts of wind that threatened to knock her down. She eventually turned into the mouth of a crumbling tenement building, a place where the air smelled of damp stone and old coal, and Bruno slipped into the recessed doorway of a darkened grocery store across the street to wait. The reality of her world struck him with the force of a physical blow when a black sedan, identical to the ones in his own fleet, screeched to a halt in front of her building. 2 men stepped out, men Bruno recognized by the cold efficiency of their movements, soldiers from the lower tiers of his own organization. He watched from the darkness, his jaw tightening as he saw them intercept Miriam in the lobby, their shadows looming large and predatory against the peeling wallpaper. He couldn't hear their words, but he saw the way Miriam shrank back, her hand instinctively flying to the lucky star button on her coat, as if seeking protection from the metal star. One of the collectors reached out, his hand gripping the thin fabric of her shoulder with a casual cruelty that made Bruno's pulse thunder in his ears. It was a sickening realization that hit him then. The Christmas miracle she prayed for was being strangled by the very machine he had spent his life perfecting. He was the architect of the fear that made her shoulders tremble. He was the ghost behind the debt that kept her in this freezing, decaying cage. As the men finally climbed back into their car and disappeared into the night, leaving the young girl weeping silently on the stairs, Bruno remained in the shadows, his hands curled into white-knuckled fists. The lion was no longer just watching a lamb. He was looking at the wreckage caused by his own pride, and for the first time in his life, the power he wielded felt like ashes in his mouth. The following evening, the snow had settled into a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to mirror the weight in Bruno's chest as he returned to the same window-side table, his eyes fixed on the entrance until the chime of the door heralded Miriam's arrival. She looked smaller tonight, her movements hesitant as she approached him, the shadow of the previous night's encounter with the debt collectors lingering in the dark circles beneath her eyes, and the way she checked the street behind her before sitting down. Bruno watched her, his expression a mask of granite, yet beneath the table, His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of the falling ash. He didn't ask her about the men in the black sedan. To do so would be to admit he was the king of the world that was crushing her. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat and pulled out a small, frayed square of blue cashmere, laying it on the table between them. It was a blue scarf, worn thin at the edges and smelling faintly of cedar and old grief, a stark contrast to the luxury that usually surrounded him. Miriam looked from the fabric to his face, her curiosity momentarily overriding her fear, and for the first time, Bruno allowed the iron shutters of his soul to creak open just a fraction. He began to speak of a younger brother named Evan, a boy with eyes as bright as Miriam's and a heart that was too soft for the concrete jungle of the Marquetia legacy. He told her how he had tried to harden Evan, believing that love was a liability and that only power could keep them safe, pushing the boy until the light in his eyes went out and he vanished into the city's maw, leaving nothing behind but this single blue scarf. As he spoke, Bruno's gaze drifted to the tattoos on his hands, the very marks of the life that had driven his brother away. And he realized he was seeing the same hardening process beginning in Miriam, the same flicker of hope being extinguished by the debt he himself had authorized. The lucky star button on her coat glinted in the candlelight, a tiny golden beacon that seemed to mock the darkness of his confession, and Bruno felt a jagged crack form in the armor he had worn for a decade. He wasn't just a boss or a predator in this moment. He was a man haunted by the ghost of a sibling he had failed to protect, looking at a girl who still had a chance if only the monster sitting across from her chose to show mercy. Miriam reached out, her small, cold hand hovering just inches from the blue scarf, and the look of pure, unadulterated empathy she gave him was more painful than any wound he had ever received in the streets. In the quiet of the cafe, surrounded by the scent of roasting coffee and the muffled sounds of a city that didn't care if they lived or died, Bruno Marquetia finally understood that his empire was a tomb, and the girl with the burgundy coat was the only living thing inside it. The golden light of the cafe felt different to Miriam as she stepped inside the next evening, no longer a sanctuary from the cold, but a place to share the impossible radiance that was now blooming in her life. She practically floated toward Bruno's table, her burgundy coat unbuttoned just enough to reveal the lucky star that seemed to catch every spark of holiday light in the room. Her eyes, once clouded by the gray fog of survival, were now wide and luminous, carrying a vibrance that Bruno hadn't seen in any soul for a very long time. She sat down before he could even offer the seat, her words tumbling out in a breathless rush of joy as she told him about the white envelope that had appeared like a ghost on her doorstep. She spoke of the miracle that had saved them, how the crushing debt that had kept her grandmother's medicine cabinet empty and their hearth cold was simply gone, vanished as if it had never existed. She laughed, a sound like silver bells that made the high society patrons at the next table pause their whispered conversations, as she described her grandmother finally sleeping without the rasp of a cough, her breath eased by the medicine they could now afford. Miriam leaned across the table, her small hands animated, telling the unreadable man across from her that there was still magic left in the world, even in a city as hard as this one. She called it a Christmas miracle, a gift from an angel who had seen their struggle and decided that they had suffered enough. Bruno sat perfectly still, his charcoal coat a sharp contrast to the warmth of her excitement, his expression as steady as a mountain. He listened to her praise the anonymous angel, with an irony that tasted like copper in his mouth, knowing that the hands she wanted to bless were the same hands that had built the very cage she was celebrating her escape from. He didn't correct her. He didn't tell her that he was no angel, but a man who had simply decided to stop being a monster for one night. He let her believe in the miracle because her belief was the only thing mending the jagged cracks in his own heart. As she spoke of her dreams for the future, of going to school, of becoming a designer, of never having to look over her shoulder again. Bruno felt a strange, quiet satisfaction that no amount of power or wealth had ever provided. He watched the light dance in her eyes and realized that while he might never be forgiven for his past, he had bought this girl a future, and for a man like Bruno Marchetti, that was a miracle in itself. The atmosphere within the boardroom of the Marchetti estate was thick with a tension that surpassed the freezing winds howling against the glass panes. As the inner circle of the organization gathered under the dim glow of a heavy chandelier, Bruno sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of iron. But the silence was finally broken by his second-in-command, a man whose hands were as stained with the city's sins as Bruno's own. The associates began to whisper of softness, their voices laced with a dangerous edge as they questioned why a lucrative debt had been wiped clean and why a certain tenement street was now considered holy ground. They spoke of the message it sent to the other territories. That the lion was losing his teeth, that the Marchetti name was no longer synonymous with an unbreakable grip. Bruno felt the weight of their scrutiny, a predatory hunger rising from the men he had raised to be wolves, and he realized that the boundary he had drawn around Miriam was a target on his own back. He didn't flinch as his lieutenant leaned forward, questioning if a mere girl was worth the instability of their empire, but Bruno's response was not a verbal argument. It was a slow, lethal movement as he stood, his charcoal coat casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. He leaned over the mahogany table, his eyes flashing with a cold fire that reminded every man in the room why he sat in the high chair, stating with a terrifying stillness that his mercy was not a weakness, but a choice, and that his choices were the only law they needed to follow. To prove his point, he didn't use a weapon, but the sheer force of his presence, slamming his hand onto the table with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, declaring that the Sardi girl was under his personal protection, and anyone who stepped across that line would find out exactly how much softness remained in his soul. He had to fight the very culture he had created, staring down the men who lived by the code of blood until they looked away, their rebellion quelled by the sheer terrifying certainty in his gaze. As the meeting adjourned and the associates filed out with forced nods of loyalty, Bruno remained alone in the room, his breath coming in slow, steady draws. He knew the peace he had bought for Miriam was fragile, and that by shielding her, he was inviting the storm to break over his own head. He looked down at his hands, the tattoos on his knuckles a map of a violent past, and realized that to keep the girl's lucky star shining, he would have to become a monster once more, but this time, he would be a monster with a purpose. He was no longer just protecting an empire. He was protecting the only light he had found in a decade of darkness, and the choice he made that night was the most dangerous one of all. He chose the lamb over the pride. The air in the cafe felt unusually heavy that evening, the flickering candle on the table casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the ink-stained skin hidden beneath Bruno's charcoal sleeves. Miriam was talking about her plans to volunteer at the local shelter, her face radiant with the newfound freedom he had bought her. But Bruno could no longer stomach the weight of her innocent praise for a miracle he had manufactured with his own blood-soaked hands. He reached up, his fingers trembling slightly as he slowly unbuttoned the high collar of his coat, revealing the dark, jagged tattoos that climbed his neck, the unmistakable brand of the Marchetti family that had haunted the city's nightmares for generations. Miriam's voice trailed off into a confused whisper as she looked at the marks, then back to his eyes, which were now filled with a raw, agonizing honesty. He spoke the truth then, his voice a low, gravelly confession that seemed to strip away the luxury of his clothes and the safety of the cafe. He told her he was the lion she had heard of in the news, the man who owned the debt collectors she had feared, and the architect of the very system that had nearly broken her spirit. He waited for the scream, for the chair to slide back in terror, or for the look of pure loathing that he knew he deserved. But as the silence stretched between them, Miriam didn't move. She looked down at his large, scarred hands, then back up at the face of the man who had sat with her every night, listening to her dreams and sharing his own grief over a lost brother. When she finally spoke, her voice was not filled with fear, but with a profound, quiet clarity that pierced through his armor more effectively than any bullet. She told him that she knew what monsters looked like. She had seen them in the hallways of her tenement and in the cold eyes of the men who came for her family. But when she looked at him, she saw a man who had chosen to fix something forgotten. She saw the man who had protected a stranger, who had kept a blue scarf as a shrine to a lost soul, and who had used his terrible power to give a young girl back her life. She reached across the table, her small hand covering his tattooed knuckles in a gesture of absolute, shattering forgiveness. And for the first time in his life, the monster felt the heavy chains of his past begin to fall away. She wasn't forgiving the mafia boss. She was forgiving the man who had found his way back to the light. And in that moment of grace, Bruno Marchetti finally understood that the greatest power he would ever possess was not the ability to take a life, but the courage to be saved by one. Exactly 1 year later, the city was once again held in the crystalline grip of winter. But the snow that fell against the glass of the small cafe felt like a blessing rather than a shroud. Inside, the golden light was just as warm, the scent of cinnamon just as sweet, and the soft jazz carols hummed with the same quiet peace that had anchored a life-changing encounter 12 months prior. Every table was full of laughter and the clinking of spoons, but at the window, the table that was once a lonely fortress of silence was now a sanctuary of connection. Bruno sat in the same chair, though his charcoal coat was replaced by a simpler, softer wool, and the boardroom tension that had once stiffened his shoulders had vanished, leaving behind the relaxed posture of a man who finally slept without a weapon beneath his pillow. He had walked away from the high-rises and the black cars, dismantling the empire of fear to build a foundation of hope, and though the ink on his neck still told the story of where he had been, his eyes now reflected where he was going. The cafe door chimed, and Miriam stepped in, no longer the shivering lamb in a coat too big for her frame. She wore a tailored jacket of her own design, a deep, vibrant green that spoke of growth and life, and her hair caught the light with a healthy luster that mirrored the steady fire in her gaze. She wasn't carrying a tattered envelope or the weight of a family's debt. She carried a sketchbook filled with the dreams she was finally allowed to chase. She slid into the seat across from him, the seat she had once asked if was reserved only for the rich, and offered a smile that was the true miracle of the season. 2 mugs of steaming cocoa sat between them, topped with clouds of cream, and as they reached out, their hands met in the center of the table. They didn't need to speak of the shadows they had escaped or the dangerous choices they had made to get here. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a bridge. To anyone passing by in the snowy night, they were just 2 people sharing a quiet moment in the glow of the holidays. But to the man who was no longer a boss and the girl who was no longer poor, they were the living proof that even the most broken life can be stitched back together with a single thread of courage. As the bells of a nearby cathedral began to chime, signaling the arrival of Christmas, they sat together in the warmth. Just a man, a girl, and the simple, staggering magic of being seen. Thank you so much for sitting with us through this journey of shadows and light. We hope the story of Bruno and Miriam touched your heart as much as it did ours while crafting it. You are truly the heartbeat of this channel, and we want you to know that you are deeply loved and appreciated. In this corner of the internet, you aren't just a viewer. You are part of our family, and we cherish every second you spend with us. If this story moved you, please, we beg of you, hit that subscribe button and join our growing family. It would mean the world to us if you could like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that redemption is always possible. Your support is what keeps these stories alive and allows us to keep bringing hope to your screen. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and we want to know, which moment brought a tear to your eye? Was it the reveal of the blue scarf, or the moment Miriam forgave the man behind the machine? Do you believe a person like Bruno can truly change their nature, or was it Miriam's lucky star that did all the work? What should our next story be about? We value your voice and want to tell the stories you want to hear.